Can one person confront power and change history? Human beings have asked this question for thousands of years, because throughout history, ordinary people have often stood before enormous systems that seemed impossible to challenge. Empires, kings, governments, oppression, injustice. Most people adapt to power, fear it, obey it, survive beneath it. But every once in a while, a single individual appears who dares to resist. And perhaps no story in the Bible captures that tension more dramatically than the story of Moses. A man born under a death sentence, raised inside the palace of the very empire enslaving his people. A man divided between two identities, Hebrew by blood, Egyptian by upbringing, prince and outsider at the same time. Yet Moses does not begin as a fearless hero. He begins as a deeply conflicted human being, angry, impulsive, uncertain, afraid, and perhaps that is exactly what makes his story feel so modern. Because modern people often imagine history-changing individuals as naturally powerful, confident, charismatic, certain of themselves. But Moses repeatedly doubts himself throughout his life. He fears speaking, fears failure, fears confronting Pharaoh, fears responsibility itself, which raises a deeply human question. Why do people remain silent in the face of injustice? Fear, survival, exhaustion, powerlessness. Human beings often adapt psychologically to systems they secretly know are wrong because resisting those systems feels impossible. Slavery had become normal in Egypt. Oppression had become routine. Generations were born into suffering so long-lasting it began feeling permanent. And perhaps modern humanity understands this more than it wants to admit. Because injustice still exists everywhere. Corruption, exploitation, manipulation, abuse of power, economic inequality, systems benefiting the powerful while crushing the weak. Most people feel too small to change any of it, which is why Moses becomes psychologically fascinating. Because his story is not only about miracles, it is about confrontation. One fragile human being standing before overwhelming power and refusing to bow completely. But confrontation always carries a cost. Speaking truth threatens comfort, threatens safety, threatens identity. Moses loses almost everything before he becomes a leader. After killing an Egyptian in anger, he flees into exile. The prince becomes a fugitive. The man raised in privilege becomes a shepherd wandering through the wilderness. And perhaps this reveals another painful truth about transformation. Sometimes people must lose old identities before discovering who they truly are. Moses spends years hidden in obscurity, forgotten, isolated, far from power, far from Egypt, far from destiny itself, until one moment changes everything. A burning bush in the desert, fire that does not consume, and a voice calling his name. Imagine the psychological weight of that moment. Moses is not asked to improve his own life. He is asked to confront an empire, to walk back into the place of trauma, to challenge the most powerful ruler in the world. And perhaps the most important detail is this. Moses does not immediately say yes. He hesitates, questions, doubts himself. Who am I to do this? That question still lives inside modern people today. Who am I to speak, to lead, to resist, to change anything? Most individuals secretly feel too small against systems larger than themselves. Yet history repeatedly changes because certain people act despite fear. Not because fear disappears, but because something becomes more important than fear. Moses' story forces humanity to confront one of its deepest questions. Can one imperfect person truly confront power and change the course of history? Or do systems always crush individuals eventually? And perhaps the most unsettling part of Moses' story is this. The moment he finally answers the call, His life becomes harder, not easier, because sometimes the path toward meaning begins exactly where comfort ends. Before Moses became a prophet, before the plagues, before the Red Sea, before confronting Pharaoh, he was a child born into fear. Egypt had become a machine of power built upon oppression. The Hebrews multiplied rapidly, and Pharaoh began fearing them. Fear is important here, because powerful systems often justify cruelty through fear. Fear of losing control, fear of losing status, fear of outsiders. Fear transforms human beings psychologically. Once people become convinced, another group threatens their security, empathy weakens quickly. Pharaoh responds with brutal logic. Hebrew baby boys must die. Imagine the emotional atmosphere surrounding Moses' birth. Mothers hiding pregnancies, families living in terror, human beings trapped beneath a political system that viewed their existence as dangerous. And perhaps this is why Moses' story immediately feels larger than one individual life, because it begins inside a world where power determines whose lives matter. Moses survives only because his mother hides him desperately and places him inside a basket on the Nile. A baby floating between life and death, between destruction and survival. And perhaps symbolically, Moses' entire life will remain suspended between worlds. Hebrew by birth, Egyptian by upbringing, slave by ancestry, prince by environment. Pharaoh's daughter discovers him and raises him inside the palace itself. Imagine the psychological complexity of that identity. Moses grows up surrounded by Egyptian privilege, while knowing somewhere deep inside he does not fully belong there. Human beings need identity psychologically. Belonging creates emotional stability, but Moses exists in a painful in-between space. Too Hebrew to be fully Egyptian. Too Egyptian to fully return to his people easily. And perhaps many modern people understand this emotional tension deeply. Children of immigrants, individuals between cultures, people raised between conflicting identities. Human beings often struggle profoundly when they feel divided between different worlds. Moses likely received the best education in Egypt: wealth, status, power. Yet external privilege does not erase internal conflict, because identity is not built only through environment, blood, memory, belonging. Emotional truths still matter. Moses grows up inside the palace of the empire, enslaving his own people. Imagine the psychological contradiction. Every privilege surrounding him is connected to a system built upon suffering. And perhaps this reveals a timeless human tension. How do people live morally inside unjust systems benefiting them personally? Modern society still struggles with this constantly. Economic exploitation, political corruption, systems rewarding privilege unequally. Many people benefit from structures they secretly know are unfair. Moses embodies that tension internally. Another important psychological reality emerges here. People shaped between two identities often experience isolation. Moses may have looked powerful externally, but internally he likely struggled with confusion about who he truly was. Human beings naturally seek coherent identity narratives. People want to know, who am I? Where do I belong? What side am I on? Moses cannot answer these questions easily. He lives inside contradiction itself. And perhaps contradiction creates emotional pressure over time. One day Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Something inside him finally breaks. He kills the Egyptian. Think carefully about that moment psychologically. This is not merely anger. It is identity collision. Years of internal tension exploding outward suddenly. Moses can no longer emotionally separate himself from the suffering of his people. Yet his response is impulsive, violent. Human beings carrying unresolved identity conflict often act explosively. Once emotional pressure becomes unbearable, Moses attempts to solve injustice through force. And perhaps this reflects another timeless human instinct. When people first awaken morally, they often mistake anger for wisdom. But anger alone rarely creates lasting transformation. Another painful reality appears immediately afterward. Moses realizes he now belongs nowhere. Egypt rejects him because he murdered an Egyptian. The Hebrews do not automatically trust him either. One Hebrew asks, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" Imagine the emotional isolation in that question. Moses risks everything, yet still remains an outsider. This becomes psychologically devastating because human beings need recognition and belonging from some group. Moses suddenly loses both identities simultaneously. Prince no longer, deliverer not yet. He flees into exile, into the wilderness, alone. And perhaps exile becomes one of the most important psychological phases of his life. Modern society often fears isolation intensely. People distract themselves constantly to avoid silence and self-confrontation. Yet transformation frequently begins in isolation. The wilderness strips away false identity. Status disappears. Privilege disappears. Egypt disappears. Moses becomes simply human again, a shepherd wandering through emptiness. And perhaps this is psychologically necessary, because people often cannot hear deeper truth while surrounded by noise, comfort, and external validation. Moses spends decades in obscurity. Think about that carefully. Decades. Modern culture worships speed, instant success, instant visibility. But profound transformation usually unfolds slowly. Moses must first confront himself before confronting Pharaoh. Another deep psychological lesson appears here. Identity crises often precede purpose. Human beings usually discover deeper meaning only after old identities collapse. Career collapse, relationship collapse, emotional breakdown, exile. Many people discover who they truly are only after losing who they thought they were. Moses loses the palace before discovering the mission. Another important aspect of Moses' life between two worlds is empathy. People raised entirely inside privilege sometimes struggle to recognize suffering outside themselves. Moses experiences both worlds directly: power and oppression, privilege and exile, palace and wilderness. This dual experience reshapes him psychologically. Suffering often deepens perception. Human beings who experience hardship frequently develop greater emotional understanding afterward. Moses eventually becomes capable of leading slaves partly because he himself experienced displacement and loss. Another painful truth hidden in Moses' early life is this: identity confusion creates emotional exhaustion. Many modern people secretly feel fragmented internally. Different personalities in different environments, different masks, different expectations. Social media intensifies this fragmentation further. People constantly perform identity instead of living authentically. Moses' divided life reflects that human struggle. Who are you when worlds conflict inside you? Another profound lesson emerges from Moses' exile. Powerlessness can prepare people for responsibility better than power itself. Egypt taught Moses status. The wilderness taught him humility. Egypt taught control. The wilderness taught dependence. Egypt gave him privilege. The wilderness gave him self-knowledge. Human beings often become dangerous when given power before developing character. Moses first needed the wilderness, and perhaps modern people do too. Modern culture increasingly avoids silence, isolation, reflection, discomfort. Yet, without those experiences, people often remain psychologically shallow. Another fascinating aspect of Moses' divided identity is that his weakness eventually becomes part of his strength. Because Moses understands both worlds, he can eventually stand between them. Between Pharaoh and the slaves, between oppression and freedom, between power and suffering. Human beings who survive divided identities sometimes develop deeper empathy, precisely because they understand contradiction personally. And perhaps that is why Moses remains such a psychologically powerful figure. He is not born fully formed, not naturally fearless, not emotionally certain. He spends years lost between identities before discovering purpose. And maybe that is why modern people still connect deeply with his story. Because many individuals today secretly feel caught between worlds too. Between ambition and meaning. Between comfort and conscience. Between social expectation and authentic identity. Moses' life suggests something profoundly important. Sometimes the people most capable of changing history are themselves. Moses had already lost everything once. The palace, status, identity. Egypt, the man who once lived among power, now wandered through wilderness silence as a shepherd. And perhaps that silence lasted longer than people realize. Not days, not months, decades. Think about that carefully. Modern people often imagine destiny arriving quickly. Dramatic transformation. Instant purpose. But Moses spends years hidden in obscurity before history ever remembers his name. And perhaps this matters psychologically, because many human beings secretly fear being forgotten, irrelevant, invisible, wasted. Moses once belonged to the center of Egyptian power. Now he lives far away from history itself. A shepherd in the desert. Ordinary, silent, unknown. And perhaps this is where one of the deepest transformations of his life begins. Because isolation changes people. Wilderness strips away distraction. No palace, no applause, no status, no performance. Human beings often avoid silence because silence forces self-confrontation. But the wilderness leaves nowhere to hide. Moses must finally live with himself, his anger, his guilt, his failure, his uncertainty. And perhaps this is why the burning bush appears in the wilderness rather than the palace. Some truths can only be heard after the noise disappears. Then one ordinary day changes everything. Moses sees something impossible. A bush burning, but not consumed. Fire without destruction. Imagine the psychological impact of that moment. The wilderness had become predictable, repetitive, familiar. And suddenly, reality itself seems to break open. Human beings are psychologically shaped by routine. Most people stop truly seeing the world after familiarity numbs perception. But moments of mystery interrupt that numbness. They force attention awake again. Moses approaches the fire, and then comes the voice. Moses. Imagine hearing your own name spoken from within impossible fire. This is not merely a religious moment. It is existential, because throughout history, one of the deepest human desires has been this: to feel personally seen, known, called. Human beings fear insignificance intensely. People want to believe existence contains meaning larger than survival alone. The voice calling Moses' name becomes symbolic of that longing. The forgotten shepherd is not forgotten. The exile still matters. The broken man still has purpose. And perhaps modern humanity needs that reminder more than ever. Many people today quietly feel invisible, lost inside systems too large to change, replaced by algorithms, corporations, routines, endless digital noise. Moses' moment at the bush confronts one of humanity's deepest fears. The fear that life may ultimately be meaningless. But then comes the command, the impossible command. Go back to Egypt. Think about the psychological terror hidden inside those words. Egypt is not merely a location for Moses. Egypt is trauma, failure, shame, fear. The place where he killed a man. The place where he lost his identity. The place where power once crushed him emotionally. And now he is being asked to return. Human beings often imagine purpose leading toward comfort, but meaningful purpose frequently demands confrontation with fear instead. Moses is asked not merely to revisit Egypt, but to confront Pharaoh himself, the most powerful ruler in the world. A man representing empire, domination, and absolute political power. And perhaps this is why Moses immediately resists. He does not suddenly transform into a fearless hero. He hesitates, questions, doubts himself repeatedly. Who am I to do this? That question is profoundly human, because most people secretly feel inadequate before enormous responsibility. Modern culture celebrates confidence publicly, but privately many individuals feel terrified of failure, terrified of inadequacy, terrified of speaking. Moses voices exactly those fears. He argues with God, makes excuses, tries avoiding the calling entirely. What if they do not believe me? What if I fail? I am not a good speaker. These are not the words of a fearless man. These are the words of someone painfully aware of his weakness. And perhaps that is what makes Moses psychologically believable. Because real courage rarely begins with certainty. Courage often begins with fear. Another important psychological truth appears here. Human beings often underestimate themselves because they define identity by past failure. Moses still sees himself partly as murderer, exile, failed prince. Trauma reshapes self-perception. People carrying shame often struggle imagining themselves capable of meaningful impact afterward. Modern people experience this constantly. Someone fails publicly and stops believing in themselves. Someone experiences rejection and fears vulnerability forever afterward. Someone carries guilt and feels permanently disqualified from purpose. Moses embodies that internal struggle. Another profound aspect of the burning bush is the symbolism of fire itself. Fire throughout human history represents danger, transformation, destruction, purification. Yet this fire burns without consuming. Perhaps symbolically, this reveals something important about meaning itself. Some experiences transform people without destroying them completely. Suffering changed Moses. Exile changed Moses. Wilderness changed Moses. Yet something essential inside him survived. Modern people often fear hardship because they fear destruction of identity. But sometimes hardship burns away illusion instead. Pride, false identity, dependence on external validation. Moses needed the wilderness before confronting Pharaoh. Another psychologically powerful moment appears when God reveals the suffering of the Hebrews. Ye have seen their oppression. Think carefully about that phrase. Human suffering often feels invisible. Oppressed people throughout history frequently feel abandoned by power, forgotten by society, ignored by history. The idea that suffering is seen matters deeply psychologically. Human beings can endure enormous pain if they believe the pain matters to someone. Moses now becomes connected to something larger than personal survival. Purpose expands identity beyond the self. And perhaps this is why people throughout history have risked their lives for causes greater than comfort. Meaning gives suffering direction. Another important tension appears in Moses: resistance. He wants certainty before action. Human beings constantly desire guarantees, clear outcomes, predictable success, but meaningful missions rarely provide total certainty beforehand. Moses must move forward without fully knowing how events will unfold. This remains psychologically difficult for modern people too. Individuals wait for complete confidence before acting, before speaking, before changing life, before pursuing purpose. But certainty rarely arrives first. Action often precedes clarity. Another fascinating aspect of the burning bush story is identity transformation. Moses enters the wilderness, seeing himself as a failed exile. He leaves the bush carrying a new identity: messenger, leader, liberator. Human identity is shaped partly through the stories people believe about themselves. Trauma creates one narrative: Eve failed, I am weak, I am nobody. Purpose creates another: my life still matters, I am capable of meaning. He can confront fear. Moses does not instantly become fearless, but he begins moving anyway. And perhaps that is one of the deepest lessons hidden inside the burning bush. Human beings often wait to feel transformed before acting, but transformation frequently happens while acting despite fear. Another powerful psychological theme here is confrontation with power itself. Most people adapt to oppressive systems because challenging them feels impossible. Pharaoh represents overwhelming external power. Moses represents fragile human conscience. Lone man against empire. And perhaps history repeatedly depends on such moments. Individuals willing to speak despite fear, to resist despite weakness, to confront systems larger than themselves. Moses' story suggests something profound. History does not always change because powerful people decide to become moral. Sometimes history changes because broken, uncertain individuals choose to answer uncomfortable calls. Another deeply modern insight from the burning bush is this: people often discover purpose precisely in places they wanted to escape. Moses fled the wilderness emotionally shattered, yet the wilderness becomes the place where meaning finds him. Modern people often assume painful seasons are interruptions of life, but sometimes difficult seasons reshape identity in necessary ways. Silence teaches things noise cannot. Exile teaches things comfort cannot. Weakness teaches things power cannot. And perhaps that is why the burning bush appears after decades of obscurity, instead of during Moses' years in the palace. The palace gave Moses status. The wilderness gave him depth. And maybe that is the final psychological truth hidden inside the fire. The people most capable of confronting power are often not those born strongest, but those who have already been broken deeply enough to stop worshiping comfort above truth. Why do human beings fear responsibility so deeply? Why do people hesitate when called toward leadership, truth, or difficult action? Why do so many individuals remain silent, even when they know something is wrong? These questions stand at the center of Moses' story. Because when the burning bush calls Moses, his first response is not confidence. It is fear. Excuses. Resistance. Who am I to do this? And perhaps that question reveals something universal about human psychology. Most people secretly feel inadequate before great responsibility. Human beings often imagine history changing figures as naturally fearless. But real responsibility usually feels terrifying precisely because people understand the weight of failure. Moses is being asked to confront Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the world, a political system built upon fear and oppression, and empire. And Moses knows exactly how dangerous power can be. He already lost everything once, which means responsibility now threatens not only comfort, but survival itself. Human beings naturally avoid situations involving uncertainty and risk. Responsibility creates both, because responsibility means consequences, pressure, visibility, judgment, possible failure. Modern people experience this constantly. Many individuals want success abstractly, but fear the responsibility attached to it concretely. Leadership means criticism. Parenthood means sacrifice. Speaking truth means conflict. Commitment means vulnerability. Responsibility forces people beyond passive existence. And perhaps this is why avoidance becomes psychologically attractive. Avoidance protects temporary comfort. Moses tries avoiding the calling repeatedly. He questions his qualifications, questions his ability to speak, questions whether people will even listen to him. These fears remain deeply modern. What if I fail? What if nobody believes me? What if I am not enough? Human beings often fear responsibility because responsibility exposes inadequacy publicly. Remaining passive feels emotionally safer. Another profound reason humans fear responsibility is because responsibility destroys excuses. Once people accept responsibility, they can no longer remain innocent observers. Action becomes necessary. Sacrifice becomes necessary. Responsibility transforms suffering from abstract awareness into personal burden. Moses could have remained in the wilderness, safe, hidden, anonymous. But answering the call means carrying the pain of an entire people emotionally. And perhaps this reveals another timeless truth. Many people prefer comfort over meaning because meaning is heavy. Meaning demands participation. Participation creates suffering. Modern society often encourages passive spectatorship instead. Endless entertainment, endless commentary, endless distraction. But responsibility requires action rather than observation. Another psychological reason humans fear responsibility is fear of transformation itself. Responsibility changes identity. People cannot remain the same after accepting genuine responsibility. Parents change, leaders change, caregivers change, individuals confronting injustice change. Moses understands instinctively that returning to Egypt will destroy his old life permanently. Human beings often resist responsibility, not because they lack ability, but because they fear becoming different people afterward. Another important aspect of responsibility is visibility. Responsibility places people in positions where failure becomes public. Moses fears humiliation. Human beings are deeply sensitive to social rejection. Shame activates profound psychological pain. This is why many people remain silent despite knowing truth internally. Fear of embarrassment, fear of criticism, fear of looking foolish. Social media intensifies this fear dramatically today. Public judgment is instant, permanent, viral. Many individuals silence themselves to avoid attack. Moses' hesitation reflects this ancient human fear. What if I stand up and fail publicly? Another deep reason humans fear responsibility is because responsibility removes the illusion of personal innocence. Once people recognize suffering clearly, they must decide whether to respond. And response always costs something. Time, comfort, energy, safety. Moses could no longer pretend ignorance after the burning bush. Awareness itself becomes burden. This still happens psychologically today. Many people avoid difficult truths because truth creates moral obligation. Climate crisis, exploitation, corruption, abuse. Human beings often prefer emotional distance because awareness demands responsibility. Another psychological truth hidden inside Moses' fear is imposter syndrome. Moses repeatedly focuses on weakness. He cannot speak well. Why would anyone follow me? Modern psychology recognizes this pattern clearly. Many capable individuals secretly feel fraudulent internally. They believe others are naturally qualified while they themselves are inadequate. Ironically, people most aware of responsibility often fear it most because they understand consequences deeply. Meanwhile, reckless individuals sometimes pursue power carelessly because they lack humility. Moses' fear may actually reveal emotional maturity rather than weakness. He understands the gravity of leadership. Another profound aspect of responsibility is loneliness. Leadership isolates people psychologically. The greater the responsibility, the fewer people fully understand the burden. Moses eventually becomes emotionally exhausted repeatedly throughout his journey. Human beings carrying responsibility often suffer silently because others see authority, but not the emotional cost underneath it. Parents experience this. Leaders experience this. Teachers, activists, caregivers. Responsibility frequently creates invisible emotional fatigue. Modern society often romanticizes leadership without acknowledging its psychological weight. Another major reason humans fear responsibility is fear of conflict. Moses is not asked to improve Egypt politely. He is asked to confront Pharaoh directly. Confrontation threatens stability. Human beings naturally avoid conflict because conflict risks rejection and danger. Many individuals tolerate unhealthy situations for years simply to avoid confrontation. Toxic workplaces, abusive relationships, corrupt systems. Silence becomes emotional survival. Moses must overcome that instinct. Another painful truth is this: responsibility often makes life harder before it makes life meaningful. Modern culture frequently sells simplified visions of purpose. Follow your calling. Chase your dreams. Change the world. But real responsibility usually creates stress first. Moses' life becomes more difficult after answering the call. Pharaoh resists. Conflict escalates. Pressure intensifies. Human beings often abandon responsibility quickly because they mistake difficulty for failure. Yet meaningful change almost always produces resistance. Another psychological reason humans fear responsibility is because responsibility forces confrontation with limitation. Moses cannot free the Hebrews alone. Human beings often avoid responsibility because they fear discovering their limits painfully. What if effort is insufficient? What if the system is too strong? What if nothing changes? Many people remain passive, partly because trying and failing feels more painful than never trying at all. Moses faces this fear directly. Another fascinating insight hidden inside Moses' hesitation is this: people often underestimate the power of imperfect individuals. Modern society worships charisma, perfection, confidence, polished image. But history repeatedly changes through flawed people acting courageously despite weakness. Moses stutters, doubts, fears, yet still becomes the leader confronting Pharaoh. Perhaps this reveals something profound. Courage is not perfection. Courage is movement despite imperfection. Another deeply modern lesson concerns responsibility fatigue. Modern people feel overwhelmed constantly by global problems. War, economic instability, climate anxiety, social conflict, political corruption. Many individuals psychologically shut down because the scale feels too enormous. What difference can one person make? Moses likely felt the same confronting Egypt. Lone man against empire. Yet history repeatedly shifts because individuals choose action despite feeling small. Another painful truth about responsibility is sacrifice. Responsibility always costs something: comfort, simplicity, freedom, peace. Moses loses the possibility of ordinary life once he accepts the mission. Modern people often desire impact without sacrifice. But meaningful responsibility inevitably demands emotional cost. Another profound psychological reality is that responsibility creates purpose. Human beings psychologically deteriorate when life feels meaningless. Endless pleasure rarely satisfies deeply. People need significance beyond self-interest. Viktor Frankl observed this clearly. Meaning sustains human beings through suffering more powerfully than comfort alone. Moses' burden becomes enormous, but burden also gives direction. Modern society increasingly struggles with purposelessness, partly because responsibility itself is often avoided. Another important lesson from Moses' fear is humility. Arrogant people often seek power carelessly. Humble people fear responsibility because they understand human fragility. Moses' hesitation may partly explain why he eventually becomes capable of leadership. He does not begin intoxicated by ego. He begins aware of weakness. Another deep truth hidden in Moses' story is this: responsibility is rarely convenient. Human beings often wait for ideal timing before acting morally. But injustice rarely pauses until people feel ready. Moses is called wild, uncertain, afraid, emotionally unprepared. Yet action still becomes necessary. And perhaps this is the final psychological lesson hidden inside the burning bush. Human beings often fear responsibility because responsibility demands becoming larger than comfort, larger than fear, larger than self-protection. Most people spend life avoiding that transformation. Moses eventually accepts it, not because fear disappears, but because suffering greater than his own fear finally becomes impossible to ignore. And maybe that is how history always changes. When ordinary, frightened individuals finally decide responsibility matters more than safety. Moses finally returns to Egypt, the place he once fled in fear, the empire that shaped him, the empire that broke him. And perhaps this is where the story becomes truly dangerous. Because confronting injustice sounds heroic in theory. Until confrontation becomes real, Pharaoh is not merely a man. He represents absolute power, political control, economic dominance, fear institutionalized into civilization itself. Egypt survives through slavery. The suffering of the Hebrews supports the comfort of the empire. And perhaps this is why Pharaoh becomes psychologically timeless. Because every generation creates systems benefiting some people through the suffering of others. Exploitation changes form, but never fully disappears. Moses walks directly into the center of that system. Imagine the emotional pressure of that moment. The former fugitive now standing before the ruler of the most powerful civilization in the world. Human beings often fantasize about confronting power, but reality feels terrifying. Power humiliates, threatens, crushes opposition publicly. Pharaoh likely sees Moses not as a threat, but as absurd. A shepherd demanding freedom for slaves, one fragile man against empire. Yet perhaps history repeatedly changes through exactly such impossible confrontations. Moses speaks, "Let my people go." Simple words, yet psychologically explosive. Because oppression depends partly upon silence. Systems survive when nobody dares challenge them openly. The moment truth is spoken aloud, fear begins cracking. Pharaoh refuses immediately. Of course he does. Human beings benefiting from unjust systems rarely surrender power voluntarily. Why would they? Egypt's economy depends upon Hebrew labor. Freedom threatens comfort for the powerful. And perhaps this remains painfully modern. Throughout history, liberation movements constantly encounter resistance because justice often disrupts existing privilege. Another disturbing psychological truth appears next. Pharaoh increases the Hebrews' suffering after Moses speaks. The slaves must now make bricks without straw. Same expectations, less support, impossible labor. This becomes psychologically devastating because people often expect truth to improve life immediately. But confrontation frequently intensifies suffering before transformation arrives. Modern people experience this constantly. Someone leaves a toxic relationship, and loneliness temporarily worsens. Someone exposes corruption and becomes attacked publicly. Someone begins healing emotionally, and suppressed pain surfaces first. Liberation often becomes painful before becoming freeing. Another heartbreaking moment follows. The Hebrews themselves begin turning against Moses. Imagine that psychologically, Moses risks everything for liberation. Yet the oppressed people themselves resent him because conditions worsened. This reveals something deeply human. Suffering can make people fear change more than oppression itself. Human beings adapt psychologically even to painful systems because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. Slavery had become normal, predictable, survival-oriented. Freedom sounds inspiring abstractly, but terrifying concretely. Another profound truth emerges here. Liberators are often rejected before they are celebrated. Human beings, under oppression, frequently become emotionally exhausted. Hope itself feels dangerous because disappointment hurts too much. Moses now stands between two worlds again, hated by Pharaoh, doubted by his own people. Leadership becomes isolation. Another psychologically fascinating aspect of Pharaoh is his hardened heart. Again and again, he refuses change despite escalating consequences. Why? Because power changes human psychology. People deeply attached to control often interpret surrender as death of identity. Pharaoh cannot separate himself from domination. To release the slaves would feel like weakness. And perhaps modern systems still operate similarly. Corporations protecting profit despite harm. Political leaders protecting ego despite truth. Individuals refusing accountability because pride matters more than transformation. Pharaoh becomes symbolic of the human tendency to resist moral change even when destruction becomes obvious. Then the plagues begin. Water turns to blood, darkness, disease, locusts, death. Egypt itself begins unraveling. Psychologically, the plagues represent collapse of false certainty. Empires appear invincible, until suddenly they are not. Human beings often worship systems believing they guarantee security permanently. Wealth, governments, technology, power. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates how fragile human systems truly are. Pharaoh believes himself untouchable. The plagues slowly destroy that illusion. Another painful aspect of liberation is sacrifice. Freedom always costs something. The Hebrews do not simply walk effortlessly into liberation. Egypt collapses around them first. Modern people often desire transformation without disruption, healing without pain, justice without conflict, freedom without sacrifice. But deep change almost always carries emotional and social cost. Another important psychological reality appears during the repeated confrontations between Moses and Pharaoh. Moses gradually changes. The fearful shepherd slowly becomes a leader. Not because fear disappears, but because repeated confrontation reshapes identity. Human beings become stronger partly through facing what once terrified them. Courage develops through action, not theory. Moses did not begin confident. Responsibility transformed him over time. Another disturbing insight emerges from Pharaoh's resistance. Humans often cling hardest to control precisely when control is already collapsing. Pride blinds perception. Pharaoh repeatedly chooses destruction over humility. This still happens constantly today. Relationships collapse because nobody apologizes. Leaders destroy organizations rather than admit failure. People sabotage healing because ego fears vulnerability. Pharaoh becomes symbolic of destructive pride itself. Another emotionally powerful moment arrives during Passover. Hebrew families place blood on their doors while death passes through Egypt. Fear fills the night. Survival hangs uncertainly in the darkness. Psychologically, this moment captures the fragility of human life. Civilization, wealth, power, status, all suddenly appear vulnerable before mortality. Modern people still struggle deeply with this truth. Human beings desperately seek control because vulnerability feels terrifying. Yet existence itself remains fragile. Another profound lesson hidden inside liberation is this. Freedom is psychologically difficult after long oppression. The Hebrews leave Egypt physically, but slavery still lives inside them mentally. People conditioned by fear do not instantly become emotionally free. This remains deeply modern. Trauma survivors often remain psychologically trapped long after external danger ends. Oppressed societies carry generational fear. Individuals leaving toxic environments still struggle internally with old patterns. Liberation requires internal transformation, not merely external escape. Another powerful psychological truth appears at the Red Sea. Pharaoh changes his mind again and pursues the Hebrews. Suddenly, liberation appears impossible. Water ahead, army behind. Human beings often experience this exact emotional state during transformation, trapped between old identity and uncertain future. The Hebrews panic immediately. Why? Because fear resurfaces fastest under pressure. Human beings revert psychologically towards survival thinking when overwhelmed. Moses stands before the sea carrying enormous responsibility. Imagine the emotional burden. Thousands of terrified people depending on him. And still uncertainty remains. Then the sea parts. One of the most iconic moments in human storytelling. Symbolically, the impossible barrier opens. And perhaps that is why the story survives across generations. Because every human being eventually faces seas that appear uncrossable. Trauma, addiction, grief, oppression, fear, hopelessness. The Red Sea becomes symbolic of impossible transition itself. Another profound insight hidden inside liberation is this. Freedom changes history, but freedom also creates responsibility. The Hebrews are no longer slaves afterward. Yet freedom now requires choice, discipline, courage, identity. Oppression simplifies life psychologically because survival becomes the only focus. Freedom creates uncertainty, responsibility, moral complexity. And perhaps this explains why some people unconsciously prefer familiar oppression over uncertain freedom. Another painful truth emerges. Liberation never fully erases scars. Egypt will continue living inside the Hebrews psychologically for years. Trauma echoes, fear echoes, memory echoes. Yet, despite everything, the chains are broken physically. And maybe that is the deepest meaning of Moses confronting Pharaoh. One imperfect, frightened individual stood before overwhelming power and refused accepting oppression as permanent reality. And perhaps history always changes this way. Not when fear disappears completely, but when human beings decide something matters more than fear itself. The sea had opened. Pharaoh's army was gone. The chains were broken. Egypt was behind them. From the outside, the story looks victorious. Liberation, freedom, triumph. But psychologically, freedom is far more complicated than escape, because leaving oppression physically does not automatically remove oppression internally. Human beings carry systems inside themselves long after the external system disappears. Trauma echoes, fear echoes, slavery echoes, and perhaps this is where Moses' story becomes deeply modern again. The Hebrews leave Egypt, but Egypt does not immediately leave the Hebrews. Generations had been born into slavery. Think about what that means psychologically. Slavery was not merely labor. It was identity conditioning, fear conditioning, survival conditioning. Human beings adapt emotionally to environments over time, even destructive ones. People living under oppression often develop psychological patterns necessary for survival. Silence, dependence, hypervigilance, fear of authority, learned helplessness. Modern trauma psychology understands this clearly. Long-term oppression reshapes the nervous system itself, which means liberation creates emotional confusion before it creates peace. Another profound truth appears immediately after freedom. The Hebrews begin panicking constantly, complaining, doubting, longing for Egypt again. This shocks many readers. Why would people miss slavery? But psychologically, the answer is deeply human. Familiar suffering often feels safer than uncertain freedom. Human beings fear uncertainty intensely. Egypt was cruel, but predictable. The wilderness is free, but unstable. No clear future, no certainty, no structure. Modern people experience this same psychological tension constantly. Someone leaves a toxic relationship, then misses it emotionally later. Someone escapes an unhealthy job, then panics without familiar routine. Trauma survivors sometimes unconsciously return toward destructive environments because the nervous system associates familiarity with safety. Freedom can feel terrifying when people were conditioned by fear for too long. Another important psychological consequence is collective trauma. The Hebrews do not suffer only as individuals. An entire community carries historical pain together. Generational suffering reshapes cultures. Children inherit fear from parents. Anxiety spreads through families. Oppression creates psychological memory, surviving long after external events end. Modern societies still carry these wounds today. War trauma, poverty trauma, racial trauma, political trauma, generational fear. Human beings inherit emotional patterns silently across generations. The Hebrews carry Egypt inside their minds even while walking away physically. Another painful consequence of liberation is identity collapse. For generations, the Hebrews understood themselves primarily as slaves. Now, suddenly, they must become free people. But freedom requires identity transformation. Human beings need meaning and structure psychologically. Slavery had provided imposed structure externally. Freedom now demands internal responsibility, and responsibility feels overwhelming. This remains deeply modern. Many people secretly fear freedom because freedom creates accountability. Choice becomes exhausting. Responsibility becomes heavy. Some individuals prefer systems telling them exactly how to live because uncertainty feels emotionally unbearable. Another major psychological consequence appears in Moses himself. Leadership isolates him profoundly. Modern culture romanticizes leadership constantly, but rarely acknowledges its emotional burden. Moses becomes responsible for an entire nation's survival. Imagine the psychological pressure. Thousands of frightened people constantly projecting fear, anger, anxiety, frustration onto him. Leaders often become emotional containers for collective fear. Parents experience this. Teachers experience this. Political leaders, activists, caregivers. The greater the responsibility, the greater the invisible emotional weight. Moses repeatedly reaches exhaustion throughout the journey. He becomes frustrated, overwhelmed, emotionally drained, because no human being is psychologically designed to carry endless pressure alone. Another painful truth hidden inside Moses' story is this. People often attack the individuals trying to help them when suffering intensifies. The Hebrews repeatedly blame Moses during hardship, hunger, fear, uncertainty. Human beings under stress frequently search for visible targets for emotional frustration. Modern societies still behave this way, constantly. During crisis, fear often transforms into blame. Leaders become symbols for collective anxiety. Moses experiences this repeatedly. Another important psychological consequence of oppression is dependency. Long-term control weakens confidence in personal agency. Slaves become accustomed to external authority making decisions. Freedom now requires independent moral responsibility. This transition becomes emotionally difficult. Modern psychology recognizes similar patterns in abusive relationships. Victims often struggle making autonomous decisions after prolonged control because identity became conditioned around survival and obedience. The Hebrews repeatedly ask for certainty, direction, immediate security. Freedom feels overwhelming psychologically. Another fascinating consequence is spiritual exhaustion. Moses repeatedly encounters doubt despite miraculous events. Why? Because trauma weakens trust. Human beings conditioned by fear struggle sustaining hope consistently. Modern people often judge emotionally exhausted individuals too harshly, but prolonged suffering changes perception. Anxiety narrows imagination. Fear narrows trust. Oppression narrows hope. The Hebrews are not merely rebellious. They are psychologically wounded. Another profound psychological theme appears through the wilderness itself. The wilderness becomes symbolic of transition identity. No longer slaves, but not yet fully free internally either. Human transformation often unfolds in uncomfortable in-between spaces. Modern people experience this constantly. After divorce, after career collapse, after emotional breakdown, after leaving harmful environments, the old identity dies before the new identity fully forms, and that middle space feels psychologically disorienting. Another major consequence of leadership is loneliness. Moses increasingly stands emotionally alone. Leaders often cannot fully express vulnerability because others depend on their stability. This creates emotional isolation. Moses climbs mountains alone, carries decisions alone, faces criticism alone. Leadership frequently demands sacrificing ordinary emotional simplicity. Modern people rarely recognize this invisible cost. Another painful reality emerges around anger. Moses initially kills an Egyptian impulsively. Later, he strikes the rock in frustration. Even transformative leaders remain emotionally human. Responsibility does not erase exhaustion. Human beings, carrying prolonged pressure, often experience emotional overflow eventually. Modern burnout works similarly. People suppress stress repeatedly until eventually frustration erupts unexpectedly. Moses' emotional struggles make him psychologically believable. Another important consequence of prolonged suffering is nostalgia distortion. The Hebrews begin romanticizing Egypt despite its cruelty. This happens psychologically all the time. Human beings often remember painful environments selectively. Once uncertainty becomes overwhelming, people miss toxic relationships, miss unhealthy routines, miss old identities, because memory softens pain while fear magnifies uncertainty. The Hebrews say, "At least in Egypt we had food." Notice what disappears from memory. The chains. Trauma survivors sometimes unconsciously idealize past structures because freedom feels emotionally unstable. Another deeply modern lesson hidden inside Moses' story concerns emotional contagion. Fear spreads socially. Anxiety spreads socially. Panic spreads socially. Entire groups can become emotionally overwhelmed together. The Hebrews repeatedly descend into collective fear because human beings influence one another psychologically constantly. Modern society experiences this through social media panic, political outrage, economic fear, mass anxiety cycles. Human emotions are deeply communal. Another profound insight appears in Moses' relationship with power. Unlike Pharaoh, Moses does not become emotionally intoxicated by domination. Why? Perhaps because suffering humbled him first. The wilderness broke his ego before leadership arrived. Human beings who gain power without self-awareness often become destructive. Moses remains psychologically different from Pharaoh because he remembers weakness personally. Another major psychological consequence is the burden of expectation. Once Moses becomes leader, people expect impossible things from him constantly. Human beings often project fantasies onto leaders. Certainty, perfection, salvation. But leaders remain fragile humans internally. Modern celebrity culture operates similarly. Society idealizes individuals unrealistically, then turns against them once flaws appear. Moses repeatedly experiences this emotional cycle. Another painful truth hidden inside liberation is this: freedom alone does not heal human nature automatically. Even after escape from Egypt, fear remains, conflict remains, selfishness remains, insecurity remains. External liberation cannot fully solve internal struggle. Modern revolutions repeatedly demonstrate this. Systems change, yet human weakness persists. Another profound psychological lesson from Moses' journey is that meaning often emerges through burden rather than comfort. Moses' life becomes extraordinarily difficult after accepting responsibility. Yet purpose deepens identity. Modern culture increasingly worships comfort, but comfort alone rarely satisfies the human soul deeply. People need meaning larger than self-preservation. Another difficult reality appears near the end of Moses' story. He never fully enters the promised land himself. Think about the psychological weight of that. Moses sacrifices everything for liberation, yet does not personally receive the final reward. This reveals one of the deepest truths about responsibility. Meaningful lives are not always measured by personal reward. Sometimes individuals help build futures they themselves never fully experience. Parents do this. Teachers do this. Revolutionaries do this. Moses becomes symbolic of sacrificial leadership itself. And perhaps the deepest psychological consequence of his journey is this. Once human beings confront suffering deeply enough, they can never fully return to ordinary life again. Moses begins as a confused man between two identities. He becomes someone carrying the emotional weight of history itself. And maybe that is the final lesson hidden inside his story. Freedom is not merely escape from chains. Freedom is the painful, lifelong process of rebuilding identity after fear no longer controls the soul. Moses' story may feel ancient, but psychologically it describes the modern world with disturbing accuracy. Because humanity still struggles with the same fears: fear of power, fear of responsibility, fear of uncertainty, fear of freedom itself. One of the most important lessons from Moses' life is this. Most people underestimate how much fear controls human behavior. Pharaoh rules through fear. The Hebrews obey through fear. Even Moses initially runs from responsibility because of fear. Fear shapes politics, relationships, careers, identity. Modern society still operates psychologically through fear constantly. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of financial collapse, fear of public judgment, fear of not being enough. Social media amplifies this further. People constantly compare themselves against others, while secretly fearing inadequacy. Moses' story reminds humanity that fear itself is not weakness. The real danger is allowing fear to decide the direction of life permanently. Another deeply modern lesson from Moses concerns identity. Moses grows up between two worlds: Hebrew and Egyptian, prince and outsider, privileged yet emotionally divided. Modern people often experience the same fragmentation internally. Different identities, online and offline. Different personalities at work and at home. Different masks, depending on social expectation. Many individuals secretly feel disconnected from their authentic selves because modern culture rewards performance more than authenticity. Moses' life suggests something powerful. Identity crises are not always signs of failure. Sometimes they are necessary stages before transformation. Another major lesson concerns comfort. Modern civilization worships comfort constantly. Convenience, entertainment, immediate gratification. Yet Moses discovers purpose not inside the palace, but inside the wilderness. Silence, isolation, difficulty. Modern people increasingly avoid discomfort at all costs. Boredom, solitude, emotional confrontation. But growth rarely happens inside permanent comfort. The wilderness symbolizes those painful seasons where old identity collapses before deeper meaning emerges. Modern people often panic during these seasons. Career, uncertainty, heartbreak, emotional burnout, existential crisis. Yet sometimes the wilderness is not punishment. Sometimes it is preparation. Another profound modern lesson from Moses' story is about confronting systems. Most individuals feel powerless before enormous structures, governments, corporations, social pressure, economic systems, cultural expectations. People often believe one person cannot make meaningful difference. Moses challenges that assumption directly. When frightened, individual confronts empire itself. And perhaps history repeatedly changes this way. Not because ordinary people become fearless, but because some individuals eventually decide silence is more painful than speaking. Another deeply modern insight concerns leadership. Modern culture romanticizes leadership constantly. Influence, fame, visibility. But Moses' story reveals the psychological cost underneath leadership. Loneliness, pressure, criticism, emotional exhaustion. Leaders often become emotional containers for collective fear and frustration. Parents experience this. Teachers experience this. Activists, managers, caregivers. Responsibility creates invisible emotional weight. Modern burnout frequently emerges not because people are weak, but because they carry prolonged psychological pressure without rest. Moses repeatedly reaches emotional exhaustion throughout his journey. This makes him psychologically human rather than mythologically perfect. Another important lesson from Moses' story concerns freedom itself. Modern people often think freedom means absence of restriction, but the Hebrews reveal something deeper. Freedom can feel terrifying. Why? Because freedom creates responsibility, choice, uncertainty, accountability. Human beings often prefer familiar suffering over uncertain freedom. This explains why people remain trapped inside. Toxic relationships, unhealthy routines, meaningless jobs, destructive identities. Familiar pain can feel emotionally safer than unknown possibility. The Hebrews repeatedly long for Egypt despite slavery because the nervous system becomes attached to familiarity. Modern trauma psychology confirms this constantly. Another major lesson from Moses concerns speaking truth. Modern society increasingly pressures people toward conformity. Public opinion shifts rapidly. Social punishment can become severe. Many individuals silence themselves to avoid criticism or rejection. Moses' confrontation with Pharaoh becomes symbolic of moral courage itself. Speaking truth often creates conflict before transformation. People exposing corruption, injustice, abuse, manipulation rarely experience immediate comfort afterward. Resistance intensifies first. Another profound lesson hidden inside Moses' story is this. Liberation is psychological, not merely external. The Hebrews escape Egypt physically, but remain emotionally shaped by slavery for years. Modern people experience similar struggles constantly. Someone leaves abuse, but still carries fear internally. Someone escapes poverty, but still feels unsafe emotionally. Someone leaves toxic environments, yet old survival patterns remain. Healing takes longer than escape. Freedom requires rebuilding identity internally. Another deeply modern lesson concerns responsibility fatigue. Modern people feel overwhelmed by endless crises. Economic anxiety, climate fear, social division, political instability, information overload. Many individuals psychologically shut down because the scale feels unbearable. What can one person possibly do? Moses likely felt the same standing before Pharaoh. Yet history repeatedly proves individuals still matter. One voice can inspire resistance. One action can influence generations. Another important insight from Moses' life is humility. Modern culture often celebrates arrogance disguised as confidence. But Moses repeatedly doubts himself. And perhaps that humility becomes part of what makes him capable of leadership. People most aware of human weakness often lead more responsibly than those intoxicated by ego. Pharaoh represents pride. Moses represents reluctant responsibility. This contrast remains psychologically relevant today. Another major lesson from Moses' story concerns distraction. Modern civilization constantly distracts people from deeper existential questions. Endless scrolling, endless entertainment, endless stimulation. But the burning bush appears in silence, in wilderness, in stillness. Human beings often cannot hear deeper purpose because life is too noisy. Moses' journey suggests something uncomfortable. Solitude and reflection may be psychologically necessary for meaningful transformation. Another deeply modern truth hidden inside Moses' story is this: people often wait too long for certainty before acting. Moses repeatedly asks for reassurance, proof, guarantees. But meaningful action rarely begins with complete certainty. Relationships, purpose, leadership, creativity, change, all require movement before full clarity exists. Modern people frequently remain emotionally paralyzed because they want guarantees life cannot provide. Moses moves forward while still afraid. And perhaps that is what courage truly is. Not absence of fear, but action despite fear. Another profound modern lesson from Moses concerns generational impact. One individual's courage can reshape countless future lives. Parents shape children. Teachers shape generations. Leaders shape cultures. Human beings often underestimate how far consequences ripple through history. Moses never fully enters the promised land himself, yet future generations live inside the freedom he fought for. This becomes deeply important psychologically because modern society increasingly measures life through immediate reward, but meaningful impact often unfolds beyond personal recognition. Another final lesson hidden inside Moses' story is this: human beings cannot eliminate fear completely. Even Moses continues struggling emotionally throughout his journey. But fear does not need to become destiny. Systems of oppression survive partly because people believe nothing can change. Moses becomes symbolic of the moment someone decides to challenge that belief. And perhaps that is why his story still matters today. Because modern humanity continues asking the same question Moses once faced in the wilderness. Can one imperfect, frightened person truly confront power and help change the future? And maybe history's answer has always been yes, but only when someone decides truth matters more than fear. Perhaps Moses' story was never only about miracles, not only about plagues, not only about the Red Sea. Perhaps it was always about something far more human: the terrifying relationship between freedom, responsibility, and fear. Because every human being eventually faces some version of Egypt, a system, a fear, a chain, something controlling life so deeply it begins feeling permanent. And perhaps the most dangerous chains are not always physical. Some chains are psychological: fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of speaking truth, fear of becoming who we might actually be. Moses becomes symbolic of the moment a human being stops accepting fear as destiny. Yet what makes his story profound is this: Moses never fully stops being afraid. He doubts, questions, becomes exhausted, feels overwhelmed, repeatedly, which reveals one of the deepest truths about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the decision that something matters more than fear. Another haunting truth hidden inside Moses' story is that human beings often adapt to oppression. Slavery becomes normal. Injustice becomes routine. Silence becomes survival. The Hebrews eventually fear freedom itself because uncertainty feels more terrifying than familiar suffering. And perhaps modern humanity still lives inside this paradox constantly. People remain inside toxic systems because change feels dangerous. Stay inside empty identities because uncertainty feels unbearable. Accept lives that slowly suffocate the soul because familiarity creates psychological comfort. Moses confronts not only Pharaoh, but humanity's attachment to fear itself. Another profound philosophical tension appears between Moses and Pharaoh. Pharaoh represents power without humility, control without compassion, ego refusing transformation. Moses represents weakness transformed through responsibility. One clings to domination. The other accepts burden. And perhaps this conflict exists inside every human being. The desire to control versus the willingness to serve. The desire for comfort versus the willingness to confront truth. The desire for certainty versus the courage to walk into the unknown. Another difficult truth hidden inside Moses' journey is this: freedom is psychologically exhausting. Human beings often romanticize liberation without understanding its cost. Freedom requires choice, responsibility, moral accountability. Many people secretly prefer systems that tell them exactly how to live because uncertainty feels overwhelming. The wilderness becomes symbolic of that painful space between old identity and new identity. No longer slaves, but not yet fully free internally either. Perhaps all transformation happens there, in uncomfortable in-between spaces. Another existential question emerges from Moses' story. Why do human beings need meaning larger than themselves? Moses could have remained anonymous in the wilderness, safe, forgotten. Yet something inside human beings longs for significance beyond survival alone. Modern civilization often offers distraction instead of meaning, entertainment instead of purpose, consumption instead of transcendence. Yet people still feel empty. Why? Because human beings do not merely want comfort. They want lives that matter. Moses' story suggests meaning often arrives through responsibility rather than pleasure, through burden rather than ease, through sacrifice rather than self-protection. Another profound insight hidden inside the burning bush is this: perhaps human beings are transformed most deeply not by power, but by confrontation with truth. Moses spends years in the wilderness, stripped of status and illusion. The palace gave him privilege. The wilderness gave him self-knowledge. And perhaps modern humanity desperately avoids silence because silence forces confrontation with the self. Without distraction, who are we really? Another haunting aspect of Moses' life is that he never fully enters the promised land himself. Think about the existential weight of that. He sacrifices comfort, identity, peace, simplicity, and still does not personally receive the final destination. Yet perhaps that reveals one of the deepest truths about meaningful lives. Some people plant trees whose shade they will never sit beneath. Parents do this. Teachers do this. Revolutionaries do this. Meaningful existence is not always measured by personal reward. Sometimes meaning comes through contributing to futures beyond ourselves. Another powerful truth hidden inside Moses' story is this: human beings cannot fully eliminate suffering from the world. Even after liberation, conflict remains, fear remains, weakness remains. Yet confronting injustice still matters. Why? Because refusing to confront evil allows fear to become permanent reality. Moses does not create a perfect world, but he breaks the illusion that oppression is unchangeable, and perhaps that is enough to alter history. Another final philosophical question remains: why are human beings so afraid of responsibility? Perhaps because responsibility destroys the illusion of innocence. Once people truly see suffering, they must choose whether to respond. Moses responds, imperfectly, fearfully, humanly, yet he still responds. And maybe that is why his story still survives across thousands of years. Not because Moses was superhuman, but because he was profoundly human. Weak, uncertain, flawed, yet willing to walk toward truth despite fear. And perhaps that is the final lesson hidden inside the story of Moses. History does not always change because powerful people become moral. Sometimes history changes because ordinary, frightened individuals finally decide they can no longer remain silent.